Hey there, nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we are back with another episode of Cheap Shots. This is the series that is dedicated to showing you how to save money on the miniatures wargaming hobby. And on today's episode, episode number 61, we're going to show you guys how to quickly, as well as more importantly, cheaply paint up a unit of Seraphon Terradon Riders. So as you can see in this image, this is what the end result will be. It's going to have a beautiful tabletop standard, and the initial cost of investment in order to paint up this unit to look like this is only going to cost you $30.07 with our cheapskate method. And of course, that is assuming, of course, that you're purchasing all the materials that we recommend for the very first time and that you don't have anything on hand. Now, when you equate that with the same materials that you need to buy from Games Workshop as well as Army Painter in order to paint this way, you're talking about a grand total savings of $154.78. So that being said, ladies and gentlemen, let's get this video on a roll and show you guys exactly how to cheaply and quickly paint up some Terradon Riders. Alright, so the very first step you need to do is, of course, is to prime your miniatures. At the same time, we also recommend that when you guys assemble these miniatures for your Terradon Riders, you might want to break up your Terradon Riders into sub-assemblies. So first thing you want to do, of course, is to build your Terradons and mount them upon the flying stacks that's located on their bases, and at the same time, keep the Riders off to the side. As you can see in this example, I just put some temporary glue basing real quick on my Riders from my Terradons, and I kept them on small little spare round bases that I have, so that way I can paint up the Riders and then glue them later on onto the Terradons once they're done completing being painted. Alright, in this case, you want to prime your miniatures in a white primer. And the reason why you want to use a white primer on this method is because we are doing a quick paint method, so we will be using extensive oil washing in order to do all of our washes together. Now, oil washing is a really nice technique that's really fast to paint your miniatures, but the problem though is that it mutes down your colors. So in this case, you want to make sure that your dry brushing as well as your base coat colors are actually quite vibrant, so that way when you do the base coating with the oil wash, it's going to mute down those colors. And white primer does an excellent job of making those colors very bright as well as very vibrant. And when it comes to doing your primers, pretty much what ends up happening is that the primer gives a rough, uneven surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to, because if you were to take acrylic paints and apply to bare plastic, what ends up happening is that there is nothing really for the acrylic paint to adhere to, and just kind of slides off right off the surface, and it gives you a destroyed finish for your miniatures. So in this case, we're using flat white primer by Rust-Oleum Paint. You can get this stuff at your local Walmart for $3.99. Just do the quick once over for your Terradons as well as your Riders, and you're ready to move on. In this case, we're actually going to start off with the Riders first, and then we're going to show you guys what you need to do for the Terradons. So the first thing we're going to work on real quick are the Riders. Now in this situation, you can see here, you might notice I have some Night Goblin netters, and the reason why is because when I bought these miniatures, I bought them secondhand and I bought them used, and the guy I bought them from did not have the little skink riders on them. So because I was able to get these for a very, very steep discount, which is absolutely fantastic. So because of that, the little portion there, the Night Goblins, you could skip that portion because the one rider that we do on the right hand side, the skink, that was probably the method you want to use. In fact, now I think about it, it's actually going to be very cheaper for you to actually paint this method because you won't need to worry about doing the goblins. But in any sense, this is what we did. First thing we did, of course, we base coated the flesh. Now for my Night Goblin Riders, I picked those out in 2 thin layers of crisp green. You can find this at your local Walmart by Apple Barrel Paint. It costs 50 cents for a 2-ounce tube. And then for the skink rider, I used Tahitian blue by Delta Serum Coat. It's a nice light turquoise color. Just put 2 thin layers of this base coat down for your flesh, and then you're ready to move on. Now for the skink warrior that is riding upon the Terradon, on the back of each of the skink miniatures, you actually have these scales, these hardened armored scales that they have on their shoulders as well as their back, and it goes down the length of their tail. So for this color, what I decided to use is to use 2 thin layers of bright blue by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a 2-ounce tube that costs you 50 cents at your local Walmart. I just picked those details out in 2 thin layers of bright blue, so that way it kind of has a nice vibrancy from the paler turquoise color from the softer scales. And of course, we're going to dry brush these next. So for my Night Goblin Riders, I just do a quick dry brush real quick with lime sherbet. It's 50 cents at your local Walmart, 2-ounce tube from Apple Barrel Paint. The reason why I like to use this color is because dry brushing, what it does, it basically catches pigment on the raised surfaces of your miniature while leaving the darker color in the recesses of the model. What this does, it creates a 3-dimensional effect where you have highlights as well as recesses on the miniature, and kind of gives that illusion of depth for your miniatures as well. Now, if you notice, there is a very rough, unfinished, chalky appearance when you get done dry brushing. Don't worry about that. That is all part of the process of dry brushing. Once we apply all that, our oil wash these miniatures, that will smooth out for that texture. But for now though, just do a quick dry brushing with your lime sherbet. Now, as for the Skink Warrior, we decided to do an all-over dry brush using Dutch Aqua. It's a nice, very pale turquoise color that reacts very nicely with the Delta coat, the coat of Delta Serum Coat Tahitian blue that we put on the miniature, as well as the bright blue we put on the hardened scales in the back. So when it comes to dry brushing, a good rule of thumb is to always start off with a light dry brushing layer first, because you can always add more additional layers of dry brushing to your miniatures to whatever degree of lightness that you want. But once you apply the dry brushing, though, the only way you can go back to darker is by actually just re-base coating your miniatures. So always start off with light dry brushing and build off from there. So the next color we use in our palette is Pavement by Apple Barrel Paint. You can find this stuff at your local Walmart for 50 cents. In this case, I use this color for the robes of the Night Goblins, and I also use it for the shaft of the spear that the Skink Warrior is carrying. Now, Pavement is a really dark gray. It's almost black, but it's actually quite an off black, almost like a really dark gray. And the reason why I like using this color so much is because when you dry brush with lighter grays, it has a really beautiful finish when you do that. So because I just put 2 thin layers of pavement, and you're ready to move on for your dry brushing. So this next step is for my Night Goblins. In this case, what I decided to do real quick is I do a quick dry brushing with light Pale Gray by Folkart. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for 75 cents. I did a dry brushing on their robes to cast the raised surfaces to add some field of depth to the robes that they're wearing. At the same time, I also put 2 thin coats of Pale Gray along the teeth of the Night Goblins as well. These Night Goblins have these menacing grins on their faces, and they have a lot of teeth showing. So put 2 thin layers of Pale Gray, and that detail is taken care of. Now, as for their nets that they're carrying, I did put 2 thin layers of Khaki Paint by Apple Barrel Paint. It runs at 50 cents at your local Walmart. I just did 2 quick thin layers of the Khaki Paint, and we're ready to move on to our metallics for our riders. Now for the Skink Rider, I decided to pick out the metallics in gold, and the reason why is because these riders actually do have quite a bit of gold on them. They have head crests, bracelets, arm cuffs, they also have anklets as well as weapons as well. And the gold color is a very nice contrasting color that complements very nicely with that turquoise and the blue that we have in the miniatures. So as you can see in this face, this character's got like a war headdress going on. He's also got a handle that he uses to grip onto his Terradon. And I also picked out the details in the shaft of his spear, as well as the butt cap, as well as the arm bracelets and anklets that he has as well. I just picked it on 2 thin layers of Folkart's Pure Gold. It runs at 75 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. Just put 2 thin coats on that, and you're ready to move on to our very last metallic. Now, the very last metallic color that we use, of course, is for all the silver pieces. So in this case, I use Folkart's Gunmetal Gray. It's a beautiful gunmetal color. It's also really dark silver. I just put that on 2 thin layers on every detail that I wanted to be painted silver. So things like the blade of the spear that the Skink Warrior is carrying, as well as a little skull icon on the top of his headdress. I also did exactly the same thing with the little crescent moon charms on the edges of the netters as well. And once you put those 2 thin coats of gunmetal gray, the last thing we need to do now is work on the finer details, and our riders will be finished. So for the very last detail we need to work on are the shoes, as well as the cording around the robes of the Night Goblins, as well as the feathers hanging off of the Skink Warrior. Now for the Night Goblins, I use Territorial Beige by Apple Barrel Paint. Runs at 50 cents at your local Walmart. I just put 2 thin layers along the rope belts that they have for their robes, as well as for the leather of their boots. And then as for the Skink Rider on the right hand side, I picked out all the feathers that he has hanging off him in 2 thin layers of bright magenta. That also costs you 50 cents at your local Walmart as well. And once you get those final details finished with, we're all done with the riders, and our next half of this video is going to be dedicated to the actual Terradons. So for my Terradons, as you notice in this one, I actually painted them in 3 different colors on this one. And the reason why is because, well, like I said before, when I purchased these miniatures, I purchased them secondhand. So the guy had already built them already ahead of time, and he had no leftover sprue. So I really couldn't customize these creatures, and they all looked very different. So I figured instead of just painting them all the same color, just make each one unique, just to add to the fact that they're all different miniatures. So what I decided to do is I decided to paint up the Ripperdactyl on the left-hand side with red by True Red by Anita's Acrylic. It is a beautiful dark and strong toned red. It's actually some of the best red paint I've ever used in miniatures painting. I can't gush enough about this stuff. I mean, that's how good this stuff is. Now you'll need to put 2 thin layers of the True Red over onto the on the Ripperdactyl, and you're just covering the entirety of the miniature for right now. You don't need to be particularly neat because you're doing the entire coat in bright red and True Red. I'm sorry. Now the one in the middle for that Terradon, I was kind of inspired by a kids movie called How to Train Your Dragon, and in that movie the main character rides a black dragon named Toothless, and I thought that dragon looked really cool and very unique. So that was my inspiration for that paint job. So for the Terradon in the center, I picked them on 2 thin layers of Pavement by Apple Barrel Paint as well. And like I said, we're just doing an all over coat over the entirety of the miniature, so you don't need to be particularly neat at this stage. And then finally for the one on the right hand side, I used yellow by King's Gold by Apple Barrel Paint. It's kind of like a rich mustardy kind of golden color, and so because I just put 2 thin layers on that miniature, and you're ready to move on. So once you have the miniatures painted, the next thing we do now is to do a quick dry brush. In this case, I used Cameo Pink for the Ripterdactyl in red. I used Anita's Acrylic Gray for the black Terradon in the center, and I also used Sunny Day Apple Barrel paint for the yellow Terradon on the right-hand side. Now, all these colors are pastel variants of the base coat that they have on top of them, so because that does add a lot of highlighting to it. Just do a quick dry brushing real quick on the miniatures, and you can ready to move on. Now, like I said before, when it comes to adding dry brushes, it's always a good idea to add in layers, starting off with a very light brush and then building up. Otherwise, you might make a mistake like I did. For my Terradon on the left-hand side, my Ripterdactyl for the red one, I got a little overzealous with the Cameo Pink on that one, so it ends up being more pink than red, which is perfectly fine. I decided to keep going with that whole pink motif because I really did not want to rebase that miniature with another base coat, so I just moved on from there. So be careful with your dry brushing, because you can get a little overzealous with it sometimes, and it might bring it to the degree of brightness that you don't want. So, and be very important to pay attention to that. So once again, the next thing we do now is start painting the wings of the Terradons. So the best thing I like to use a lighter version of the color from the flesh that we use for the Terradons. So for the Ripterdactyl left-hand side, since it's already pink looking already, I decided to use Bright Magenta by Apple Barrel paint. Put 2 thin layers on all the wings, the membranes of the wings. I did exactly the same thing with Pewter Gray for Apple Barrel paint for the dragon, for the Terradon that's in black and the center of the table. And then of course I used just regular yellow by Apple Barrel paint as well for the wing membranes for the yellow Terradon on the right hand side. I put 2 thin layers of each of these paints. Each of these paints can be found at your local Walmart for 50 cents. And once you guys are done with the base coating for the wings, the next thing we do now is to do a stipple as well as a dry brush on the edges of the wings. So this next step is actually entirely optional, but if you want to add a kind of a subtle design to the edges of the wings to make it look like they've been weather worn and they have like this kind of gradient pattern for reptilian creatures, you might want to do this step. Now this next step is actually going to be focused entirely upon the edges of the wings, as you can see from the miniatures I'm showing from behind as well as from the black miniature on the top. All you need to do real quick is just do a real quick light dry brushing with your colors. I use Cameo Pink for the red, Pale Gray from Folk Art for the black one, as well as Sunny Day for the yellow one. And what I did is I just did a quick dry brushing along the edge of the membranes of the wings on the back edge. And then from there I decided to carry on that gradient effect even further into the wing. Now for me, I like to keep my effects kind of subtle, so what I decided to use was what's known as stippling. Now what stippling does is that instead of doing a dry brush or a normal painting with your miniature, what you do with stippling is that you take an old brush, preferably one that's kind of like a flat head on it, that's been kind of worn down. An old paintbrush is perfect for this technique. What you do is you dip into your paint, but instead of brushing it on, what you do is you stab it with the paintbrush as well. What that does, it basically stipples your miniature by making little individual micro dots of color that kind of gives this nice gradual gradient effect. Now you can take this stippling as deep or as far as you want to on the wings of your creatures. For me, I didn't want to really go too deep with it just because I was kind of uncertain how the effect would look, so I was kind of conservative in my stippling on this one. But as you can see though, it looks pretty good. You got that nice weathering effect on the edge of the membranes, and of course you can take your stippling to whatever degree of brightness or depth that you want. So now that we're done with the base coating and the dry brushing for these miniatures and add the stippling, the last thing we need to do now is to work on the finer details. In this case, we're looking at things like the beaks, the horns, and the claws of these miniatures. And what I did is I picked those details out in 2 thin layers of khaki paint. Now for the Ripterdactyl, you'll notice I've actually done the entire head crest just because the head looks like a giant battering ram in my opinion. So because I picked out that detail, I also put 2 thin coats on the claws of the miniature. And each of these Terradons and Ripterdactyls have like kind of like this bladed fin that's coming out of their chest as if they could use it to skewer somebody. So I picked those on 2 thin layers of khaki paint. And the very last detail I also did as well is to put some sky blue on the eyes of each of these pterodactyl creatures. I just put 2 thin dots of sky blue for each eye, so that way you get that nice little detail. And then from there we're ready to move on to our metallics. Now, depending upon how you assembled your Terradons, the Terradons actually have this option to have like these looking mini wrecking balls that they carry, so that way they can drop rocks and these wrecking balls into their enemies. And they're also connected to these huge chains. So for me, what I decided to do is to pick it out in 2 thin layers of Gunmetal Gray by Folk Art. It's that dark silver color that we use for all the metallics in our miniature painting. I just put 2 thin layers on that boulder, and then from there we're ready to move on to the rest of the bases. Now for the base of these miniatures, where the stems are located at, on the base of each of the stems, they actually have like this pile of boulders and rocks and these looks like temple and Mesoamerican ruins. So what I decided to do is pick those details out in 2 thin layers of gray by Anita's Acrylic, and I just did it all over painting with just put 2 base coats on that one. So that way you get a good solid base coat to work off of as well. Also, if you notice in this picture, I decided to glue my riders back onto the pterodactyls that I actually painted for my Ripterdactyls as well as my Terradons. I suggest you do this at this time too, so that way you don't forget about doing it, it, because once you apply the oil wash, it's going to be very difficult to put these riders back onto their mounts. And the last bit of detailing I did for the bases is that I use a quick dry brush of pale gray by folk art to bring out the raised surfaces and the details of the rubble that's on the bases of the flying stems. So that way you got like this kind of aged stone look going on for those rubble ruins. And then from there, you're pretty much done with your base coats and your dry brushes. So once you're done with our base coating and dry brushing of our miniatures, then the last step we need to do now is an oil wash. So as I mentioned before, this is a quick paint method, so the oil wash that I like to use is to use Midwax Poly Shades Mission Oak color in order to do my oil wash on this one. Now typically when you do a quick paint method and you do an oil wash, people like to use Army Painter Strong Tone. Now, Army Painter Strong Tone is a wonderful product. It is exactly as advertised. The only problem, though, is that the Army Painter Strong Tone costs $32 a can, while a similar can of volume of Poly Shades by Midwax costs only $7. So because I like using the Midwax Poly Shades because it does exactly the same thing. The darker reddish-brown coloring of the oil washing goes directly into the recesses of the miniature, bringing out a lot of the details that these miniatures did not have before. At the same time, it also smooths out the transitions between your base coats as well as your dry brushing. So if you notice, that chalky uneven finish that we had before from our dry brushing is largely gone, and the reason why is because that oil wash has transitioned those colors. At the same time, you'll also notice that our colors are not as bright and vibrant because oil washing does mute down the colors that you use for your miniatures. So that's the reason why we use such a bright powdered colors, because that oil wash is going to mute it down for us. And the very last thing that this does is that when this stuff dries and cures, since it's mixed with polyurethane, it's going to put a hard clear coat that's on the outside of the miniatures, which is going to protect the paint job and keep it from fading as well as weathering. Now the problem, of course, is that once this dries, that polyurethane will give your miniatures a candy coat high shine finish. If you don't like the sheen of that finish, you could of course spray it with some Krylon matte varnish, and I'll talk about that later on in this video. Or if you do like that high gloss sheen, you can just leave it, and no harm, no foul. So now that we let the curing of the drying as well as the curing take place for our oil wash for 24 hours, the next thing you do now is start working on the bases. So in this case, I'm going with this Badland Wasteland based system that I use for my Orcs and Goblins, because my Lizardman army is going to be a combination of Orcs and Goblin as well as Lizardman miniatures, and I thought that that base really contrasts nicely with the turquoise and blue of the Lizardman. So in this case, we're going to use Burnt Sienna by Folk Art. It runs you 75 cents at your local Hobby Lobby, and I just put 2 thin coats on the very top of the round bases, as you can see there. And as the base is drying, I decided to start painting the stems that these miniatures are resting on. So as the surface bases were drying for the burnt sienna, I put 2 thin coats of Ocean Reef Blue by Delta Coat Serum Coat. It runs a 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. And as you'll see, it's a very bright, vibrant blue color, which contrasts very nicely with the wasteland base that we're going to put on these miniatures here in a second. At the same time, also gives the impression that these guys are kind of flying through the air with that sky blue color, which is really nice. So all you need to do is put 2 thin layers of that Ocean Reef Blue, and you're ready to move on for the finishing up of your bases. So now that burnt sienna is now dry on the bases, the next thing you do real quick is a quick dry brush using Terracotta by Folk Art. It's a nice orangey clayish color that I like using for my wasteland bases. I get this at my local Hobby Lobby for about 75 cents. And after I get done dry brushing the burnt sienna with my terracotta, the next thing I do now is I rim the bases in 2 thin coats of the exactly same color. And once you let that dry, you're pretty much done with these miniatures and you're ready to see the end result. And there you have it, folks. This is the end result of what your miniatures will look like using the quick paint cheapskate method that we showed. This is the exact same photo we showed you guys at the very beginning of the video. And as you can see, they have a beautiful tabletop standard. They're very bright, very vibrant, and they look like they're ready to bring pain into the battlefields of the old world or the new realms, depending on which gaming system you're using them for. So that being said, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about exactly what products you'll need to purchase from Games Workshop as well as Army Painter to paint exactly the same way we did with these miniatures, and talk about exactly how you can save over $130 in savings by going with our cheapskate method. Alright, so this is the shopping list you'll need to buy from both Citadel as well as Army Painter if you want to paint your miniatures exactly the same we did, except using their products. The first thing you'll do, of course, is do a primer of Corax White Spray, which runs you $17, and then from there, for your Terradons, you'll need a base coat them in 2 thin layers of Mephiston Red, Everland Sunset, as well as Eshin Gray, and all 3 of those colors run $4.55. Now for the flesh of the Goblins, you'll need to use Hellion Green, which runs you $4.55, and for the flesh of the Skinks, you'll need to use Baharoth Blue, which runs you $4.55 for that. Now for the harder scales along the back and the shoulders of the Skink Warrior, you need to buy a pot of Teclis Blue, which runs you $4.55, and then you'll need to dry brush your miniatures for your Night Goblins with Cyberite Green, which runs you $4.55 for that color. Now, before moving on to the Terradons, to dry brush your Terradons, you'll need to buy Fulgrim Pink, Aslanash Gray, as well as Hexos Pale Sun, and all 3 of those colors run $4.55 for that. Now, for the Aethermatic Blue color, which you want to use for the eyes of the miniature as well, you need to buy a pot of Aethermatic Blue for $7.80, and for the dry brushing along the wings for the black miniature as well as for the stones on the bases, you'll need to buy a pot of Ulthuan Gray, which runs you $4.55 for that color. Now for the claws and the fangs and the teeth and the claws and the crests and horns of the Terradons, you need to buy Morghast Bone, runs you $4.55 for that color. And for the metallics you'll need for the golden color for your warriors, you need to buy Retributor Armor, which is $7.80 for that. Now the next thing you need to do is buy a pot of Baylor Brown for the details of the leather goods on the riders, which runs you $4.55, and then you'll also need to buy a pot of Screamer Pink for $4.55 in order to paint out the feathers that the riders are carrying. Now, to do your stippling and dry brushing on the wings of your Terradons, you'll need to buy a pot of Eonden Yellow, I believe is how you pronounce that. That costs you $7.80, as well as Blue Horror, which costs you $4.55. Now, for the silver elements on your miniatures, you need to buy a pot of Lead Belcher, runs to $7.80 for that product. Now, since we're doing a quick oil wash with ours, you'll need to buy a can of Armory Painter Strong Tone, which runs you $32 for that product. And then for the bases, you'll need to buy a pot of Doom Bull Brown, which costs you $4.55. You'll also need to rin the bases and dry brush them with Squig Orange, which runs you $4.55. And lastly, for the plastic stems that hold up the flying miniatures, you need to paint them 2 thin layers of Talisar Blue, which runs you $7.80. And then finally, if you want to do a matte varnish on your miniatures like I have, you need to buy a can of Munitorum varnish for the cost of $19.50. Now, assuming you're buying all these Army Painter and Citadel products for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total investment of $184.85. Now, when you compare that with the Cheapskate method, which would only cost you $30.07, and you subtract the two values, you end up with a total saving of $154.78. So there you have it, you guys. This is how you guys can quickly as well as cheaply paint up some Seraphon Terradon Riders for only $31, or actually for less than $31 in this case, and saving you over $150 in savings. So that's going to do it for this one, you guys. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest, greatest hobby news related to our channel. That's going to do it for this one, you guys. We'll catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.